All right, good morning. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar, Conducting Cyber Risk Assessments for Supply Chain Risk Management. This is the third webinar in our 10-part series on cybersecurity and digitalization, with a focus on supply chain cybersecurity in the energy sector. I am Scott Morgan, Principal Consultant with Enernex, and I will help moderate today's webinar. So thank you all for joining us. Please note, as you probably just heard, this webinar is being recorded and all participants have been muted. The recording will be made available after the webinar along with a PDF of the presentation. We will be taking questions via the Q&A window. You should see interface for that at the bottom of the window. So if you have questions during the presentation, please type them into the Q&A window and we will save some time afterwards to go through those. So note, these questions are only shared with presenters and hosts. And if we don't get to your question during the webinar, we will endeavor to follow up with you and provide an answer afterwards. So today's event is organized through the U.S. Energy Association's Advancing Modern Power Through Utility Partnerships, the AMP-UP program. This AMP-UP program is funded by the United States Agency for International Development, USAID. And as I mentioned a moment ago, today's webinar is part of a 10-part series. The overarching goal of this series is to discuss the cybersecurity challenges associated with the expanding supply chain necessary to face multiple transformations in the energy sector, including integration of renewables, deployment of grid edge technologies, integration of regional markets, etc. In today's webinar, we'll hear from Frank Honkus from the Energy Information Sharing Center, or EISAC, and Mikhail Falkovich from Con Edison. Frank is the Associate Director of Intelligence Programs and the Director of the Cybersecurity Risk Information Sharing Program, or CRISP, at the EISAC. And there he supports the cybersecurity of electric utility members of CRISP through ensuring growth of that program and refinement of technical capabilities, reporting, and information sharing. And Mikhail is the Chief Information Security Officer for Con Edison, and which is one of the nation's largest investor-owned energy companies, providing electric, gas, and steam service for New York City and Westchester County, New York. So before I turn it over to them, just a quick reminder to our audience, please enter any questions you may have through the Q&A window, and we'll have time to go through those after the presentation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Frank and Mikhail. They can give a better introduction of themselves, and so please go ahead and take it away.
Thanks. Can you go to the next slide, please? So good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Honkus. Here's the agenda that Mikhail and I will be walking you through today. Next slide, please. So a little bit about myself. I am the director of the Cybersecurity Risk Information Sharing Program at the EISAC. So EISAC, we'll talk a little bit more about it in the next slide. Basically, it is a part of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and it supports the electricity subsector in the United States, Canada, and Mexico. So prior to joining here, I was at the Department of Energy's Office of Intelligence and Counterintelligence. There I was looking at CRISP data. Before that, I was supporting the United States Cyber Command. I supported what was called JBASICS. It's a Joint Base Architecture for Secure Industrial Control Systems, where we are developing defensive tactics, techniques, and procedures to detect, mitigate, and recover from nation-state level cyber attacks against control system environments. I have my master's from the University of Pittsburgh, and I also have my dual bachelor from the University of Pittsburgh. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about the EISAC. It was founded in 1999 and operates as part of NERC, like I said. Basically provides 24/7 watch support, cyber and physical threat analysis assessment. We also provide other analytical products and services. And obviously information sharing is in the name. So part of what we do is our portal, where we can get information out to our members, as well as our members being able to share back to us. Next slide. A little bit about CRISP. CRISP is a private-public partnership with the Department of Energy, and it's basically bilateral information sharing. So the member organizations or utilities share data into the CRISP program, network data specifically, and then DOE, EISAC, and Pacific Northwest National Labs conduct analysis of that data, generate reporting, and send it back to the participating members. It was founded in 2014 is whenever it came over to the NERC side, so we are celebrating our 10th anniversary. And EISAC is celebrating its 25th anniversary this year as well. So from here, I'll hand it over to Mikhail for his introduction.
Thanks, Frank. So my name is Mikhail Falkovich. I am the Chief Information Security Officer for Con Edison, and I've been in this role for the past 8 years. But over my career, which actually spans over 20 years in the utility space, I've worked in IT, I've worked in compliance, legal, and information security roles. Have worked on a number of efforts with supporting the development of standards and the development of industry guidances, and really heavily focused on collective defense efforts for the industry. My degree is in electrical engineering from Cornell University, where I did build a world champion team of soccer playing robots with my team members. A very exciting project. I really like technology, really like policy, and I always want to make sure that the right standards and the right regulations are applied so that the industry gets stronger and that we are able to provide that safe and reliable service to our customers. Next slide, please. And just a couple of words about Con Edison. We just recently celebrated our 200th year anniversary. We were founded in 1823 as the New York Gas and Light Company, and we are providing electric and gas and steam service for the 10 million people who live in New York City and Westchester County. So we are part of critical infrastructure, and we need to make sure that it is operating safely and reliably. And to that point, right, we're going to talk about supply chain and the cybersecurity risk of the supply chain to help us do that. Next slide, please, and I'll turn it over back to Frank.
Thank you. So yes, let's talk about it. So supply chain cybersecurity. The next sections here, I'm going to talk about vulnerabilities and then an example, hypothetical example to walk us through, and then I'll hand it back to Mikhail for mitigation discussion. So from a vulnerability landscape, I list off a couple areas, and there's more than just this, of how these vulnerabilities in supply chain present themselves. So for the first one, it's a hardware or software issue. It's an IT and OT issue. This isn't just one domain, and it can't be slogged off and pushed off to another group. It's going to affect both the hardware that you're purchasing or where it comes from. It can affect the software where it's developed. It can affect the IT environment. It can affect the OT environment. It depends it doesn't matter if you're buying components or if you're buying or downloading software, purchasing software, provisioning software. It introduces risks in your deployments both logically and physically. So for example, it could be a matter of the hardware that you're buying and where it's going from a physical example. So I mean, if you're purchasing cameras or something of that nature and you're deploying it in like security operations center or something like that, you're introducing that risk in those locations. And in fact, that's the hypothetical that we'll get into. From a logical example, I think of control system environments or touch points with control system environments between IT and OT. In those examples, it can introduce risk into those touch points and enable accesses or some back doors that you weren't looking to add. Risk in the procurement and contracts, or procurement for contracts and consultants. So basically what this means is that it's not just the hardware, software, it's also the people, it's also the contract language. So it could be the individuals that are coming into the contract to support the work that you're trying to do. It could be the language of the contract and basically loopholes or less than robust language that can be utilized by the subcontractor or the contractor to go off and procure items or hardware from places that you may not want. And then the final one is products versus service provider. So there's challenges with the products themselves, but there's also the service provider with the organization as a service provider that can introduce risk. SolarWinds is an example, something like that, where service provider introduce risk, not on purpose. They themselves are compromised, and it brought more or introduced risk to folks because it was providing the service, and the service could get hijacked. So it's truly a balancing of risk and vulnerability. Everybody needs hardware and software of these systems deployed in certain specific areas. And then to the next part of, that's where we get into the mitigations of evaluating everything. So before we get there, though, next slide, please. So I want to focus on country of origin with this slide. And so depending on where you're procuring your hardware, software, the country of origin risk is introduced. So what it comes down to is the standards of hardware and software development within the country is one example of that risk. So depending on the procurement and where it comes from, the country may have very high standards or very low standards. It might be, another example is regulated versus unregulated. There might be a lot of law and regulation around the development and deployment, or the steps before something goes from alpha to beta to fully developed and deployable. Or it could be Wild West, where things are just developed as needed. They fit the niche. There's not a lot of robust, practical pen testing or fuzzing, I should say, in this case of software, to make sure that it's to a level of security that a customer would want or need. And instead, it's just get it done, get it out the door, get it sold, move on to the next thing that we need to get done. Local laws come into play. So some countries, depending on their setups, may be more invasive in terms of or less respectful of privacy or no acknowledgement of privacy laws, and therefore they may be monitoring traffic if these systems are beaconing back to infrastructure or something of that nature. So that's a piece of this puzzle as well. And then implications for real-time support. So if you pick up the phone and you need help, you may be directed to a call center somewhere that you may not wish to communicate with folks, and those calls may be monitored, and they're being monitored because the laws of the land are that everything gets monitored, picked up, and monitored. So it can also be a matter of you call real-time support and you're introducing, or they need to access your system, so you're opening a tunnel to allow them in, or a VPN connection. And somebody can piggyback over that because it's the laws of the land is to be able to monitor and move. So next slide, please. Next slide, please. So let's talk about a hypothetical example. So in this case, you're trying to provision hardware, and you're working with a third-party contract. Excuse me. And so you're basically want to procure technology that you want to deploy into your electric power security and power operation centers. So you begin to work through your internal procurement process, and you essentially identify vendors through an RFP that are going to procure this technology for you and do the installation. Part of your contract terms are that the technology in question cannot be produced or must be produced in the country that you reside in, the company resides in. So it can't come from outside, regardless of where outside. It can't come from anywhere else. It has to be something homegrown and ready to roll. So the challenge here is that while the cases themselves of this piece of technology say they are produced in country X, the internal hardware is actually being produced in country Y. And so essentially country X, or the contractor is receiving components from country Y, then wrapping it with their basically their case, their hardware case in country X, and then reselling it as being developed in country X. And you're in country X. So eventually what happens is that this hardware or technology gets deployed, and then your own internal security teams begin to detect outbound network connections to country Y infrastructure. Next slide, please. So what happened? How did this go down? So there's very few companies in the world that produce their components typically within the country of origin. Most are producing their components in this hypothetical example in country Y. So these companies routinely sell this hardware from Countrywide to third parties. And then the third party, in this case, the contractor that you looked to hire, or that you did hire, was wrapping it with their own outside cover that said it was produced in Country X. The contractor themselves is unaware what's inside the case. They're just going through the supply chain, and they're just trying to procure and get the hardware that they need to service the contract. And then they're just putting their wrapper on it with their brand name. So they're not aware that this was produced basically in Countrywide. And so this really is a normal operating procedure. Many companies in the world do this, regardless of where they are. They have a requirement. They go out they find the lowest, or not lowest, well, it could be the lowest, but they go out and they find organizations that can satisfy that requirement with the technology they need in the moment. And then they purchase it, and then they put their own hardware case on it, and they resell it. And then the last piece is the outbound network communications that gets flagged and the block gets put in place. So the challenge here, and the reason why the company itself did not want components from Countrywide, is because Countrywide's laws have mandatory surveillance. And part of the software build as well is to adhere to that and that surveillance and beacon back to Countrywide, which is why you notice network activity going outbound, or network activity was going outbound to Countrywide, and discovered or led to the discovery that the internal hardware was being procured from Countrywide. Next slide, please. So from here, I'm going to hand it over to Mikhail to talk about mitigations. Take it away. I think you need to go back one slide. Oh, you keep going.
One more.
Go forward a slide. Nope, you keep still going back.
Oh, I went too far.
Still going back.
Yeah.
Keep going. One more. That's it.
Yeah.
Thank
There it
you.
is.
That's it.
All right.
Thank you.
Wrong
All
one.
right. Frank, thanks for that very engaging example. And I'm going to now talk about the management of that cybersecurity supply chain risk. And I'll first focus on the strategies on how do you manage it up front, right, before you buy something or before you engage with those third parties. And by the way, those third parties could be vendors, they could be partners, they could be any third party that you're relying on for either a product, a service, or some sort of relationship, maybe operational function. And there are many dimensions that you can assess, right? And while we're talking about cybersecurity specifically, the program should really assess multiple functions, such as financial and geopolitical, in addition to those cybersecurity controls, which may reside outside of, let's say, the cybersecurity organization. And the other thing to consider is that you can perform those assessments yourself, right, within your organization, or alternatively, you can rely on others to perform those assessments. And there are many aggregators and many vendors and let's say service providers that will actually assess the risk. The challenge is that somebody else can assess the risk, but it is up to the organization that actually consumes the product or the service to actually accept the risk. Right. So generally speaking, if you're going to use an external assessor, then the idea is they should provide a number, and then it's up to you to accept that number if you so choose. Finally, there are standards and there are frameworks that are used to help organizations assess risk. One is the ISO standard, right? So you can actually get this ISO certification. And then another one is a SOC 2. If somebody is performing a service for you or performing, again, a function for you, they can run a review, again, by an independent assessor to give additional insight into their controls that they are applying within their program. Nothing is foolproof. Nothing is going to give the full kind of lockdown and validation that everything is safe and everything is good to go. And even when something is very well done and very well secured, there's always a risk of even the most trusted third parties being breached or being impacted via cyber attack. So we just need to make sure that nothing is 100% foolproof, and that we need to take our own mitigations on top of that to manage to manage that risk for each of our organizations. And I'll talk more in the future about kind of the post-fact mitigations. And then let's think about how we assess any particular vendor. The first portion, I guess, in the process for me is to understand the risk that that service or that product or that managed service provider is performing on behalf of the organization. And the idea is if that service goes away, or if that data is lost, or if that product fails, right, how much of a risk is it for the operation of your business? And then if we can assess that risk, right, and we can potentially tier it, right, we can actually then say, well, these are the things that we need to assess based on the risk. And this is how much effort and how much risk it is. As an example, if you go to a third party and that third party needs some basic information that is readily available about your organization, even in the public space, the risk for the organization for that data loss is fairly low because it's not very sensitive. So the security controls that you may apply to that evaluation or to that product or to that service may be less so than for a provider of a critical, let's say, enterprise resource management platform that your organization may be using. And those types of assessments really drive both the application of security controls and the evaluation of the third party or the vendor to assess that risk to the organization. Additionally, as you're performing those controls, depending on where you are and depending on the region's regulatory requirements, right, you want to make sure that whatever it is that we do, that we stay within the bounds of the regulations. And some of those actually also may be supply chain related in terms of how do you manage that cybersecurity risk and how do you do you validate those controls. So NERC-CIP standards, as an example, has a supply chain standard specifically for that purpose. Once you have those tiers, right, and once you kind of set those thresholds of what is risky and what is not risky, then you can create different evaluation criteria. And then those evaluation criteria may say that, hey, if I have a small entity that is not really processing a lot of my sensitive information, but I need to do business with them, maybe I could create a self-attestation and say, you know what, here's a document, please sign here on the dotted line that you have those controls. And I would always reserve the right to audit, right? If you're doing business with that entity, even if it's a small one, have a right to audit. You don't have to audit every small business that you're dealing with, but the right to audit is important. And then the next question is, so let's take it a step further. So now I have maybe a slightly larger organization that is doing a reasonably important work for my organization. I may want to actually not just have a self-attestation, but maybe I will have a key set of criteria, a number of questions or a number of validations where I will actually have that conversation with the third party or go to an aggregator to provide that evaluation for me. And then in that instance, right, I go a little bit deeper and we would go and say, hey, let's assess that the right controls for me for that tiered level of risk is confirmed done. And then maybe that is a prerequisite to the procurement of that particular product. And then let's say that I have something where there's ultimately critical or very, very sensitive data. If they have your intellectual property, as an example, that would have a significant potential impact on the organization if that data is gone. In those instances, right, you may actually apply full sets of questionnaires to evaluate the processes, the development, the management, the vulnerability management, the notifications, many controls that you can check. But if it is critical to your business, you may want to do that. And then you may want to actually visit the entity to say, now you said that you have this thing, right, that you have these controls, and let's just validate that. And let's have that discussion with your architects, with your engineers, with the people that are providing the services for you. And then the final piece of the puzzle is contractual terms and conditions, right? So as we try to manage this risk, we want to make sure that we set the expectations of the actual business relationship and say, this is what is expected. One of the things that I would say is probably a very, very good thing to consider is notifications of security events, right? So you want to know when that particular entity that you're dealing with is actually breached or that your data may have been lost. And the sooner that your organization knows about such an event, the better. And then you would have, I would say, processes internally to actually manage those events. And by the way, again, a quick reminder, if you want to ask a specific question, the Q&A session is here. So feel free to type your questions in the chat. All right, let's move on to the next slide. I'm going to talk about industry collaboration before we actually go into those kind of post-fact mitigations. When we're talking about these types of assessments, right, there are many, many utilities or many, many organizations, and the vendors support or provide services and products to a large scale of companies, right, from the small to the large to the medium company. And the idea is that if all of us create our own questionnaires and our own process for managing risk, that makes it more difficult, both on us as entities, because each of us does things in our own way, and on the vendors. The vendors will then have to answer thousands of questionnaires that come from many different entities and are diverse, right? Because everybody is worried about different things. And so there are ways to manage this at scale. And a few years ago, right, we partnered with the government, we partnered with the industry, and we decided to create trust circles to benchmark what is right and what different organizations should do. And trust circles in general are a wonderful idea, just so that you can learn those best practices. And if you are willing to share kind of your best practices, other people will be willing to share theirs, provided you have NDAs. And then you can benchmark, and then you can see whether or not there is an opportunity for collective defense. And with cybersecurity risk management, there was such an opportunity, because in the energy industry, in the electric industry, oftentimes we have a similar set of concerns: critical infrastructure concerns, right? Operational concerns. And so because we have the same needs, we decided to get together and actually work on a questionnaire that addresses the common problems for us. So there are multiple such questionnaires. There's the SIG. There are a number of other questionnaires for education and for many different industries. But we have actually worked with the industry and the vendor community and the government to actually come up with such a questionnaire. And when we were initially thinking about this, we said, how can we do this so that it's more effective, right? Because if everybody does it differently, right, it's very cost prohibitive, very time intensive. And how do we actually make the efficiencies? How do we create the efficient way to assess vendors or assess third parties? And so the first and most important thing is that common language. If we're not talking the same language, right, then again, the vendor has to answer 1,000 such questionnaires as opposed to answering just one. So if we all standardize on that language, it really, really helps us get to an efficient process to essentially evaluate that cyber risk. Then the next conversation is, once you create that engagement with the industry and the vendors, can we centralize it, right? Can we get the aggregators to adopt it? Can we get the vendors to adopt it? Can we potentially have a clearinghouse of such questionnaires? And then once you have that centralization, and even without centralization, we can scale it up, right? And essentially getting the answers to the questions becomes much, much simpler if all of the vendors, let's say, or the majority of the vendors for the industry, have adopted that questionnaire as well and have it ready. I've actually had a number of instances where it's already in flight. And we were working on this a few years back, and was very fortunate that North American Transmission Forum was actually working on a compliance function for a questionnaire and a criteria function for how to assess vendors. And we combined efforts and created a risk questionnaire for the industry. And by the way, NERC has signed off on that as well. It is an open source product. I highly, highly advise that folks actually go to the NATF website, and there are there are links to it in the resources slide. And go there, evaluate it, see if it fits, right, and use it. Because nowadays the vendors actually let me know that, hey, you want this here? It's already filled out. We manage it. We track it. It's a wonderful, wonderful thing. And we've seen it go globally. We have actually seen global utilities go to our common vendors and actually ask them for the questionnaire. The work has been done. You just need to use it. And the more we use it, the more it scales and the more benefit actually is out there, both for our community, the actual utility industry, and for the vendors as well. And the other nice thing is, right, in this particular case, NATF is continuing to build on the questionnaire to make sure that the questions are relevant, that it is easier to use, and that it is continuing to be developed. So that is in place. And we're really looking to, again, centralize and scale. So I believe the slides, I see the question in the chat. I believe the slides are available afterwards, and I believe this is being recorded as well. Okay, so if there's an opportunity and you have the bandwidth to engage, this is an open source effort. Feel free to provide comments into NATF, and we will continue to make that process better and the questionnaire better. All right, let's go back and focus on the entities themselves. So let's move on to the next slide, please. All right, mitigations. So we talked about how do we actually work with the vendors up front before we procure. And one other thing that I did not mention there is anytime we work on a solution, on a technical solution, I look for a validation of that solution from an architectural perspective, a privacy perspective, and a cybersecurity perspective to make sure that we actually get the right data, that we're, from a privacy perspective, that we get the right things in, that we have the right architectures to make sure that it will work appropriately and is secured appropriately. And then the cybersecurity controls also are part of that initial evaluation to make sure that from a cybersecurity perspective, those operational controls are working and the cyber controls are protecting those assets. So that mitigating function happens as well pre-procurement. And to that point, right, it's not just a cybersecurity concern. We have to work with supply chain. We have to work with enterprise architecture. We have to work with the business units. We have to work with multiple organizations within our companies to make sure that we manage that risk wholesale. And now let's say that we've done all of those things and we are ready to buy and use the service or to use the product. It is very important, and specifically for services, to have service level agreements that the expectations that we have, and we got to set those expectations, right, for those critical functions are documented, and that the vendors and the service providers are meeting and their obligations, specifically for, let's say, vulnerability management, notifications for actual performance notifications, and for cybersecurity controls that you expect. And we can have those expectations, right? But not everybody lives up to those expectations. So that means that on our end, on our internal side of the house, we have to make sure that we have the process and architectural controls to actually apply additional cybersecurity controls and apply design functions that mitigate the cybersecurity risk to us from that product or service, to make sure that your data is safe, to make sure that there is segmentation, to make sure that there is anomaly detection, to make sure that the risk of those individuals that are performing the work within your environment, that is being monitored. And those controls can be both architectural, right, process. They can be technology controls. They can be procedural. But the idea is we need to assess the risk of that particular tier of service, and then we need to apply the right controls to make sure that we continue to provide those business functions. And we have to be mindful that if our controls that we apply on our relationships actually inhibit the business operational function, then we're going in the wrong direction. We need to make sure that the business function is being performed, again, safely and reliably and efficiently and effectively. And then the security controls just need to be embedded into the solutions. Okay, next bullet we have here is active monitoring and response to vulnerabilities. So yes, I expect the vendor to tell me, but sometimes that falls through the crack. Or if the vendor is a niche vendor and they may not even know about the vulnerability, we need to process and have a strong vulnerability management program to ensure that we are monitoring for those vulnerabilities in the technologies, that we are monitoring for the potential impacts to those managed service providers. And so we need to have that intelligence within our programs to tell us, hey, we need to take action even outside of what the vendor is telling us with regards to their product or service. And then I mentioned terms and conditions. Terms and conditions, right? All of those SLAs could be put in there. All of those expectations could be put in there. And then you have to manage to those terms and conditions and to those SLAs with consequences. If there's no consequences, right, then there's no teeth. If there's consequences, then right, the vendor they have to be your partner. Otherwise, they may lose the business, right? Or there are penalties for missing those SLAs. At the same time, sometimes I will have the vendor conversations on their architectural functions, and sometimes my expectations of the vendor are outside of the SLAs. And in those instances, I'm asking them to be, I guess, a good corporate citizen, or essentially help them get to that next level that is actually above the minimum service level agreement. And some vendors will be happy to do that, and others won't. And it is very important to build those relationships with the security organizations of your vendors, and with the vendors themselves, with account teams and product managers, to make sure that if you have a need that may be outside of the service level agreement that may benefit both you and the vendor, right, that you have a mechanism to get that solution in, and to have that pathway to make both the product and our operational function better. And so those expectations can also be set, but you must engage with the vendor and with the service provider to make sure that there's a path for you to have those conversations. And I'll say that there's been multiple times where a vendor would come to us and they would say, well, here's the product, and we would evaluate the product and we say, well, we should probably change the way that that product works from a communication perspective or the architectural perspective. And the vendor is always happy to consider. They don't always make the changes, but oftentimes those changes are made, and the benefit is tremendous, not just for our organizations, specifically to our organization, but to actual industry overall and to the vendor community as well. Finally, the last bullet is continued assessments. We can't just assess once. We must continue to assess our vendors, continue to assess our solutions, and have the ability to evaluate alternatives. Sometimes vendors do not hold up their end of the bargain. And in those instances, right, you need to make sure that your functionality is maintained and that your security controls are applied, and that operationally you are achieving your objectives. And if you're not, right, you need to be aware of what other opportunities are there. So we need to continue to assess the cybersecurity risk of our vendors, and we need to continue to assess their performance and support and other things of that nature, but also, right, know what is out there for alternative solutions. It's not easy to change vendors, right? It's a very difficult process, but we need to be aware of options as consumers. Okay, I think that is the end of my presentation. I am happy to either give it back to Frank or Scott if there are questions. Happy to discuss.
Yeah, thanks, Frank. Thanks,
Yeah,
Mikhail.
so I'll
Go ahead, Frank.
sorry. I was going to jump in very quickly if I can get my camera to turn back on. Just I wanted to point out this. This is the there we go. We got it. So it's just a slide of resources. These are all free resources that you can click from NIST, Cisco, United States Department of Homeland Security, and as Mikhail was talking about, the NATF. So basically, we wanted to aggregate these, put them together for folks so that they have reference material to support themselves. Thank you.
Yeah, and these resources are available, but in addition to these resources, right, create your trust circles, create that industry structures that help you, and engage with those that you can essentially create those NDAs and learn the best practices across. It's tremendously valuable.
All right. Well, thank you. So just to answer kind of the first question that came in case anyone missed it, we will be posting a PDF of the slides. I believe they'll get added to the event page for the webinar. So you should be able to return there and find a link to the slides from that site on USEA's calendar. So I have a couple questions here. So first, I guess to either of you, but really maybe Mikhail first. You talked about sort of a bunch of different risk mitigations. Sort of on one side, you had a set of mitigations that manage what the supplier does, those terms and conditions that you mentioned. On the other side, you had sort of more internally focused mitigations like the architectural and process controls. Do you see one side as a higher priority than another? Does it depend on the context? And how are you making that determination, sort of where to put your energy?
Scott, excellent question. So I think both are crucially important, right? So the terms and conditions define the way that we engage with our vendors, and they are obligated to meet them, again, because of penalties, right, or potential impacts to their business based on either financial or contractual outcomes. With regards to internal controls, right, internally, regardless of the solutions that we choose and regardless of the terms and conditions, right, we want to make sure that we trust but verify, right? We want to make sure that we actually put in those gates and those segmentations or those controls that are acceptable to us and that minimize the risk to us regardless of the technology that we use. And depending on the risk of the vendor, right, depending on the risk of the solution, then maybe we apply more controls, more stringent controls, more access controls. Right, you would have, let's say, the base level of controls for all vendors, and then you would apply more and more controls as we get to that critical service, critical product, critical data, right? Once we identify the risks, depending on the risks, we should have a set of processes and a set of controls that would be applied to mitigate those vulnerabilities, those communication paths, right? Limit communication paths, limit access, right? So that zero trust architecture should be applied across our environments.
Thank you. Yeah, Frank, did you want to add on that, or?
No, I fully agree with what Mikhail said. I was thinking of the internal controls specifically. Yeah, my experience, with several organizations has been much like Mikhail said. You have your baseline controls that you apply to everything, and then once you have better knowledge of like where the hardware is sourced from or something like that, you step it up. You'll introduce additional controls to monitor, and I'm thinking from an IT sense specifically, network monitoring or locking things down, purposefully blocking to make sure that there's outbound connections can't be established and stuff like that. So I think the approach should be certainly have that baseline, which that's you develop that for every vendor, every product, and then build from there as a foundation.
I'll actually mention one other thing which I think would be pretty useful. So that relationship with the vendors is very important. And I set an expectation for my vendors that if I'm going to be buying a product, right, I don't want to be in a position where I just get it and set it and forget it. The idea is that if you have a strong relationship with the vendor, then the vendor should actually, my expectation of my vendors is they're going to come and they're going to evaluate the way that I've implemented their product and then come back for those health checks or architectural validations to say, yeah, you're probably not using your product exactly the same way, or that configuration should be changed to meet the security needs, or to meet the functional needs that you may want, right? And so then there's stake in the game for the vendor to say, hey, you know what, I want the customer to actually use the product to the best ability, right, and to the most secure and most effective way for that entity. Use the vendors. They have developed the products. They know what the requirements or what the security controls should be, right? And if they don't, then maybe find another vendor. But that's generally my mindset.
That's great. Thank you. That actually kind of dovetails with another question. So I don't mean to put you on the spot, but Consolidated Edison is a rather large utility. So I'm sure vendors are probably sit up and listen a bit. So I was wondering, do you have advice for small or medium utility on engaging with the vendor community? Do you see those kind of large multinational suppliers as responsive to concerns of the smaller utilities? Is that threat of sort of trading off for a different supplier really carry the same weight, I guess?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I would say that smaller organization, when they deal with a larger vendor, right, may have some challenges, even sometimes in meeting regulatory requirements, right? Because some of the vendors may say, well, this is the product and this is how it's done. This is where the value proposition of engaging with the industry, right, with actually working with others like yourselves, to create those trust circles and to engage with such organizations like NATF, where you can have a voice that is bigger than yours with the vendor community, right? And the vendors are not shy; they engage with those entities, and they realize that there are large bands of smaller consumers or smaller customers that they need to be mindful of. So they listen to these organizations, and so get out there, build those trust circles, join the forums. There's strength in numbers, right? So even if you're not necessarily a large organization, there is strength in numbers. And by the way, right, so Frank is part of EISAC, right? Guess what? EISAC is one such community, and I guarantee you that there are other ISACs out there that you can probably join and use that maybe as a basis for getting your voice out there. I call Frank quite often.
He really does.
All right, building that trust circle. No, and I'm actually you're reminding me of something you alluded to earlier, that those vendors probably see a significant benefit as well of not having to answer a questionnaire for every single utility, that having that once you're sort of part of that organization, that everybody's sort of centered on the same questionnaire, they benefit from having that ready to go as well. There's another question in the chat here. If you are ISO 27001 certified, do you require your vendors of critical hardware software to have that same certification? Maybe probably applies to other standards as well.
It's a significant challenge there are many standards that you can actually pick and choose to say, hey, you're certified to a particular function. And I think it's part of your program, right? I don't believe that it is required. And if you think about critical infrastructure, sometimes you need a solution from a vendor that may not meet the ISO 27000 requirement, but you need it for operational resiliency. And so regardless of your program and of your intent, my recommendation is to make sure that you have a risk acceptance process, right? And be very, very careful about what you accept, and just stay consistent to your processes. And remember, if your policy reduces your operational capability, right, I would say probably you want to reassess your policy, or at least make sure that you have exceptions to such policy.
Great, thank you. I guess one thing you touched on in the tiering, in terms of sort of what controls you're applying and sort of what level of scrutiny to give. Can you talk a little bit more about how you evaluate the criticality of your utility systems? and how that then affects the level of scrutiny you put into the supply chain risk management for those systems?
Sure. So and I mentioned some of those kind of tiers before, but one of them is impact on the business, right? If a vendor or a product goes away or has the potential to create significant operational challenges for the organization, right? Obviously, the criticality goes way up very, very quickly. The other is the amount and type of data that we share or that we process. Specifically, when we talk about customer data, when we talk about employee data, when we talk about critical infrastructure data, different levels of risks and different levels of controls then are applied to both vendors and our internal processes. And that goes, it's not just vendor risk management, right? We need to make sure that we assess our operational needs and the tools that we use to achieve those operational needs and then apply those controls regardless of the supply chain, right? So that I just want to make sure that there's like the risk management concept is really across the board. And then once we identify the vendors specifically for those functions, then we obviously go to those vendors and then have those tiered evaluations and tiered controls of how do we manage and mitigate those risks. And then if you remember, I mentioned regulatory, right? Sometimes we are told you must meet this obligation. So we just need to be very mindful that in some instances, right, we do the best practice, and in others, right, and typically the best practice, by the way, is higher than the minimum required standard requirement. But sometimes we are obligated to meet a certain floor of controls or a certain floor of processes.
Okay, makes sense. I think you mentioned it at one point as well, about sort of starting early in the procurement process. But I guess could you elaborate a little bit more on sort of where in the procurement process you see kind of conducting this? Is it, I mean, all the way back as you're developing your specifications for an RFP that you're gonna say we must have this and this capability, or is it more that you're looking to see what they put in the response to that questionnaire and going from there?
Yes. So generally speaking, again, we have an intake process. And Frank, I'm going to turn it over to you for this one to see if you do differently. But we typically have a let's call them those loops, right? Where if a business wants to consume a product or a service, it will go through these architectural, cybersecurity, and privacy loops. And they are actually in place before a procurement occurs. So, and there are specific policies within the company that say you must go through these loops before you procure. And so that is enforced, and that way we have a consistent approach to all technology solutions across the organization. And then, right, there are policies post fact. So there's these loops are up front, and then there are other loops which are similar that happen at the end. And then the product becomes into production, and then there are other processes and supply chain management functions that happen ongoing, right? So and architectural and control functions as well. So I would say that there are specific gates to bring in a new technology or service into the organization, and then gates continue for the life cycle of the product. Frank, I don't know if you have a different perspective.
No, I agree. Like our process begins with so our process is if we want to bring in a new technology, hardware, software, whatever, we start with the cost, because depending on the cost will dictate the next like fork in the road. So typically, because if you're procuring something new, the cost isn't going to be small. Therefore, we'll usually do an RFP, and then the RFP once we march to the end of that, the next step is the RFP is not just or the RFP is finding folks' proposals to bid on it and then reviewing those. And then part of that is actually another step of reviewing the security of it. There's meetings with our IT department specifically that they have to do their own internal review. And even after a vendor selected, there's additional follow-on meetings before we'll actually authorize the contract. And then even after implementation, it's going through cycles like Mikhail was saying, where there's review periods for installation, there's sprints whenever you're doing your installations, and then there's review after that of is the product working, is it generating the what it's supposed to generate, et cetera. So it's definitely a layered and integrated approach. I know that sometimes there's a sense of urgency to get things done faster. I certainly appreciate that because I operate within a sense of urgency. But if you want to mitigate risk, I always have to put my urgency and dial it down to 10 from 11 so that I'm able to, do this in a very thought out for pragmatic fashion to avoid that risk.
This is very thorough. I guess I'm tempted to ask, I kind of want to ask if there's an instance, without naming names, where a concern over, maybe a lack of some capability came up, that kind of gave you pause in that process and made you have to sort of work with the vendor and say, I think Mikhail talked about, vendors usually being open to that kind of thing, or, I know I had one experience where, a utility was trying to procure, it was more on the IT side, a system and just the, deep into the nitty gritty of how they were going to do the single sign-on. They had differences of what protocol they were going to use, and it kind of held things up. I guess.
Yeah, so I'll mention a couple of things, maybe two instances. One is with regards to cloud vendors. And what you would find is that the cloud vendors actually continue to apply many changes all the time. And some cloud vendors are ahead of others. And the idea is that sometimes you don't have a choice. You will go to a particular vendor for a particular solution. But the idea is that that's actually the time that you have probably the most leverage to say, I would like to procure this solution, but here are my technical requirements. And again, whether it's a cloud vendor or even a vendor of a product or software or a system. And as part of that negotiation and procurement function, I've had conversations that the architecture that we expect is this. And they go, but we have it built a different way. And then we highlight the risks and we highlight the challenges with that architecture. And we say, unfortunately, I would not be able to procure that product in the way that it is now. And oftentimes that actually will drive the vendor to change the architecture and enhance the security controls for a particular solution. And that's wonderful. And there's other times when the vendor chooses not to do it, and then it's much more of a challenge. And then ideally, remember I said, look for alternatives, right? You always want to make sure that you have options. And then other times, the other consideration is once you get a vendor and the vendor solution looks good, you need to make sure that once it's in, that it actually does the thing that it's supposed to do. Because oftentimes we get the sales pitch and then the outcome is not where you expect it to be, either from a support, operationality, or just functional challenges. And again, at that point, like, listen, my policy is give the vendor a chance. Let's see if we can get it done right or get it to perform exactly correctly, and then evaluate whether you want to stay with that vendor if the solution does not perform to your needs.
Okay, thanks. So I'm looking at the time and realizing we're kind of right at the top of the hour. I saw there was one more question, would the recording of the session be available? So yes, also from the event page, I believe the recording will be posted to USEA's YouTube channel, and a link to that will be added to the event page. So since we're at time here, I just want to kind of reiterate, thank you. I want to say thank you to Frank and Mikhail for your participation today, and really thank you for sharing all of your experience and expertise. So, as I said, the recording will be uploaded to USCA's YouTube channel, and the PDF for the presentation should be added to the event page as well. And so next up, after this webinar, will be the fourth in our series, held in 2 weeks on February 8th. So that will be focused on secure remote access and cloud security in the electricity sector. So kind of topics we were just touching on. And as before, webinars will be proceeding sort of every other week thereafter. So please be on the lookout for an email announcement of future webinars. And so with that, thank you again for joining, and we'll hope to see you again on February 8th. So have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you.